we have our second day in the conference. It will be just shorter version, just the morning. We will discuss 2 papers, and then we will have a round table, and we will announce the winner of the Best Paper Award. So we will start with a paper by Professor Finger and myself, and Professor Finger will be presenting it.
Thank you. So, you know, this is a topic we have been thinking about since a long time. This whole, and it came up in this conference, the public policy dimension, the public service dimension in all of this. And basically, you know, it's a theoretical paper, more how to think about it, how to conceptualize it. And it's, I think it's a very, maybe a little bit oversimplified, but in reality, it will always get more complex after. So, you know, first define what are public services, and when doing that, we will refer, that's our approach. I mean, we think there is something to be learned from the liberalization of the network industries, and also from how public service was defined in the network industry, in the liberalizing network industries. And we can draw from that also for the digital platforms. Then, you know, second step, more conceptualizing digitalization, digital platforms in relationship to public services. And then the effects of digitalization on public services. And the last part is a little bit more exploratory in the sense, you know, where is public intervention necessary, possible in this area? Okay. So, oh, sorry, I was looking at my slides, not on the, okay, so public services, it should have been animated, but it's not, okay. So we start out on the left side, you know, with the public enterprise, the state-owned enterprise as the provider in the infrastructures, as the provider of the public services. And basically at that time, the postal service was the public service, the PTT was the public, so the railway company is the public service. So that's before liberalization. And then liberalization happens, and during the 90s, the 1990s, and at that point, there was in the context of liberalization, one has to argue why public intervention is still necessary. And so it's not just, you cannot just say we have a company and that's the public service. You have to argue why some sort in a liberalized infrastructure market, why public services are necessary, and then also the question how to finance it and who decides and all that. So liberalization is about unbundling in the network industries, that is separating out the foundational infrastructures, the natural monopoly. It's an economic argument in which there is no competition, and then layer one, and we operate with this layer model. Then on the basis of these infrastructures, there are services, but these services are competitive. Okay, so you have rail is always a good example. You have the rail infrastructure, that's a monopoly. And then you have the train operating companies that can compete against each other on this infrastructure. And so in principle, so all of this, let me go back. All of this is somehow in the public interest, but you have to now, after liberalization, be much more specific. What exactly is in the public interest and how you and how you deal with it. So the infrastructure is a service quote, I should have put it in quote, in the general interest. And they're always, in European language, there's always services of general economic and or social interest. So that can be debated, but in the infrastructure is typically in the economic interest. And then we have the services on these infrastructures. Again, let's take railways. There is competition, but in some situations we need public service or universal service obligations. So in order to assure delivery of services on the whole territory or during the whole day, or for certain groups of people, the difference between universal and public service is just a terminological definition. Universal service is used in the telecom and in the postal sector, and then public service obligations are used in the other sectors. But I don't think it's conceptually it's something different. So that's the structure prior to digitalization. And we want to see whether that framework can be used for digitalization. So now let's switch and start with digital. So we look at digitalization as we consider digitalization as a third layer on top of the two layers. So the traditional infrastructures are still there. We still have train tracks or electricity grids or whatever. We have public service obligations on some of the operators for the services. And now we have digital platforms that are a new layer. There is a discussion that we are having is whether the drawing is right, because it's not just, you can also draw the digital layer in between layer 1 and 2. But okay, the reason why we don't do this is because we want to show that what the impact of digitalization is basically the fact that the customer of the traditional service is now becoming the customer of the platform. Okay, so it's more a pedagogical thing than okay. So I think that's really the first major change. But this change, because of digitalization, has two consequences, and with one we have written about this. So typically it is platformization. That is, the digital platform is now the interface between the customer and the physical services that are delivered. And it's platformization of both. It's not just the train company, it's also the infrastructures. And in some cases, it can be substitution. That's the postal, the letter mail, the traditional service does not exist, or in media or in newspapers or in things like that. You may have direct substitution, but you still have, you always have an underlying infrastructure, somebody still needs to write the journal articles, or, at least the ones with some intelligence in it, not just written by the algorithm, but okay, so that's the sort of the conceptualization of digitalization, independently of whether we talk about public service or not. It's just, that's what's happening. Actually, you can say it's the same in logistics with Amazon, with Airbnb and all that. So it's just that with Airbnb, the foundational infrastructures are houses, which is not exactly the same thing as train tracks or electricity grids. Okay, now, one intermediary element we have in this paper is, to understand, and I think that's a little bit a shortcoming in the current EU discussions about this. What is really the nature of the digital platforms? We have this word intermediary, also, but we use intermediaries in another sense, data intermediaries. but the platforms are basically intermediaries between, from the drawing before, between the physical services providers and the customers. And those there we have direct network effects. And then on top of that, we now can have the indirect network effects with the third parties, or even other sides of a multi-sided markets. And the platforms are basically optimizing that, however you, sometimes we use the word ecosystem or whatever. You're optimizing the network effects of all these parties to the platform. And the reason why we insist a little bit on this is in the previous, we have the customer is still the customer. Whether the customer gets his or her service through the app or through buying the ticket at the train station, he's still a customer. But once you get in this, there are several customers. So yes, the customer is a customer, but the physical provider is also a customer, and the advertiser is also a customer. So the platform is optimized. It's a little bit an intellectual discussion, but it's very important. The platform needs to satisfy all the customers. And sometimes it's not necessarily the end using customer, okay? Because in order to optimize the network effects, you need to have satisfied physical services providers. And so when we really think about whom the platforms are serving, yes, they are serving the end using customer, but they're also serving and they're optimizing the whole system. So that's okay. So then next step, so now I come back to the public services. So we have now this layered model, and we have, for simplified reasons, basically we structure the impacts into three dimensions. It's a little bit oversimplified, and we can make it more sophisticated, and certainly in the future it will be more sophisticated. But there is first there is one on the financing of the physical, in the sense that now that the customer is a customer of the platform, the value added, the margins are taken by the platform. And the question is, how does the money go back to the traditional physical services, that the underlying services, okay? So in terms of public policy, and we'll see later, this is the question of, many of these infrastructures, layer one and the public service obligations in layer two are often subsidized, which then means that somehow the subsidies, a part of the subsidies goes to the platform. So that there is or simply you subsidize less, and then the quality of the infrastructure gets degraded, okay? So that's the first consequence. So what would be the answer? Maybe make the platforms pay for using layers 1 and 2. So the taxi pays a license to the city, and then Uber also should pay a license to the city, okay? Then the second point is the whole question of, I mean, in the paper, there is a whole traditional definition of what public services is, continuity and affordability and accessibility and all that, but especially the continuity of service, which in electricity we call security of supply, with the platforms, because the platforms do not necessarily have to satisfy all the customer in the same way, then how do we guarantee the security of supply of these privately owned, commercially interested, network optimizing platforms? Okay, so the whole question is, and that's the drawing from the liberalization of the network industries thing, can we impose public service obligations on platforms And you know, in the same way we impose public service obligations on the traditional, on the train operating companies, on the water distributor and all that, or on the postal service for that matter. And of course, the question also is how to link the physical and the digital. And then, you know, the big question is how about the general interest, the public, we are in the sectors where there is a public interest. I mean, that's where we start. We start from these traditional public interest sectors and how to ensure the public interest, and we had a discussion yesterday, more generally, the public policy objectives into this digital, and can we impose public policy objectives into the platforms, meaning in the algorithms of the platform. Okay, so how much time I have? 2 minutes? Okay. So basically, I'm concluding. So how can we govern these platforms? So the last question, how can we govern these platforms in the general interest somehow? And here we introduce the different political level, administrative levels, okay? So at the local level, we see smart city platforms, you know, which try, city authorities are trying to put in public policy objectives into the platforms that are operating at the city level. So we see two models. One is not in Europe. The first one I haven't seen in Europe, but more internationally, where basically you have some sort of new digital public-private partnerships whereby the city authority says, okay, you can operate, and yesterday we had this discussion about city as a platform. You can operate this platform in the public interest, and here is the PPP, okay? Okay, it's not a European approach, but it works in some emerging countries that have sufficient clout and power. Then, you know, what we see more in Europe is these city authorities, and here is the link to the intermediaries discussion that we have had yesterday, where the city authorities serve as an intermediary provider of data. It's a contractual arrangements between the ones who deliver the data, the ones who deliver the platforms, and sort of a contractual broker to impose public service objectives. So platforms there become an integral part of the urban ecosystem, and the city is the broker in between. Okay, this is a model at the local level, and maybe it's the most promising model. And then we have, you know, this approach to really see the layer 3, the digital platform, as, and that's the topic of our book, as the new network industry, in which case you would probably go for something that is a little bit more theoretical, but we see it somewhere in the European approach, an unbundling of layer 3. There is also a physical dimension of the platforms. We discussed yesterday about the data centers, you know, and data and sovereignty, about these kind of things. And then the public service, a public service obligation, maybe on certain platforms providing certain services. So mobility services, I don't know, continuity of service, also deliver over the night. I don't know how we would put this, but that would be the analogy of the traditional network industry model, unbundling. And then, you know, the EU governance, I think, really at the EU, this could be done at the national level, and then at the EU level is really how to address platform power, the Digital Market Act, digital services, you know, somehow mechanisms, and we see that too, to discipline the global platforms and the digital sovereignty regulation for the public interest infrastructures. We had this discussion yesterday about digital sovereignty and territory and all that. So this is just a conclusion, a little bit simplistic, but you know, what can be done at the local level? And we think that at the local level, there's probably the biggest potential to somehow link the digital physical ecosystem by way of, there is also, and the paper that follows is on, you know, public ownership and things like that. But I don't see many cities capable of really doing this, but some have the aspiration. Singapore, Hong Kong, but those are city states, you see, so that is a little bit easier to have just an operator. And then, you know, the continuity, the security of supply more at the national, but maybe also at the EU level, unbundling, regulation, and then the whole question, the third question, the financing, and more general, the platform power, imposing obligations on platform to somehow finance the infrastructure, you know, to that probably will have to be done at the EU level. Especially between the national and the EU, the distinction is not that clear to me. But maybe it's just a European problem. In the rest of the world, it's a little bit clearer. But basically, this is our conceptualization at this point. We put it for discussion, and we hope that you know, thanks to your feedback, we can progress on this. But this is really a topic that so far, especially this question on imposing some sort of public service, public policy objectives, in putting that into the platforms and the algorithm, that hasn't been really discussed and thought about. And there is also a question, is this technically even feasible? So thanks.
Okay. Yes, this is a few slides, but let's discuss. Let me say first that I like this paper because I will say several critical things, but let me make clear at the start and then at the end that I like it very much because is a work in progress, but still is very structured and well written. And this is extremely ambitious as a paper. It's a theoretical paper, but is facing a very topical issues in a very complex and dynamic way. It's interesting. And there are interesting ideas. In particular, there is this angle from which platforms are looked at, the idea of a platform as a public service provider that is relatively new. I will come into this in a way at the end. So let me then instead explain quickly the points on which I'm unconvinced. But these are not really, these are general issues really, but let me make it clear. First, I think that this simplification, this layers idea that has been around for a while, obviously, for instance, in telecom, this was an idea very strong. You know, there is the telecom network, and there are the service providers after unbundling and liberalization. And then over the top, there are all these people that are getting all the money, doing everything, and so on. And that's the story of there was no level playing field. It's the story of the telcos regulation of the past 20 years. I never believed completely this story. Never. And I don't believe it even in this paper, because that's not the true story. It's part of the story. Clearly, there is an element of truth, a grain of truth in this story. But first, I don't have the time because I don't want to stop too much on this, but let me say, first, the distinction between layer 1 and layer 2 is not always true. For instance, now if you look at telecom after everything is happened, and now that the mobile networks are becoming more important in certain respect than the fixed networks, you see that there is layer 1 and layer 2 are the same thing in a sense. When you have 3 or 4 mobile networks, each of the operator is layer 1 and layer 2. So I understand that in other sectors, when you have real competition, for instance, in railways, there I could understand that there could be really a difference. In electricity, sometimes you can have this because the transportation network is really something different from the operators. But generally speaking, layer 1 and layer 2 are not so divided as the authors pretend here. Second, and this is even more important, the authors make an oversimplification here, and is something that we should discuss seriously this. Platforms are of different nature. There are platforms that have done exactly what the author are describing. They have platformized the reality. But there are different platforms, and they're probably more important than the ones, or as important. They've created new business. They've created new services, invented new products. This totally innovative platform. And there is a difference also in structure of this. If you take Google, Google has created with search, has created something that wasn't there, that we didn't do that way somehow. Oh, obviously, we could look for a book and try to find the information, but that's totally different from what Google search, for instance, does. But in doing this, they have also created infrastructure, the data center, the activity that goes within Google is something that has nothing to do with, yes, they use the internet, but that's not the core of the issue, or at least it's not the whole story. Okay, so you see why I'm perplexed. And this not being too generous toward platform is a problem because it doesn't show the whole reality. Okay, that's my first point. The second general point I wanted to make is this I don't spend time. I think that this dealing in the paper as if platform and digitalization are the same thing is a problem. Because digitalization is something so pervasive and it's changing so everything that is not, to link it to platform is not a good idea. It confuses the reality, so I don't stay on this. Third point, I don't agree also with I don't agree. This is more difficult because this is the real interest in a new part of the paper, no? The attempt to analyze what platforms are or could be for public services. I think that this attempt to classify in local certain things, national orders, and European, regional levels, others, is too rigid, but I have to be honest, they are just starting to think about this. For instance, let me underline one point. When you say, okay, certain things are better at a level of regional, like control of market power, because of many things. Well, there are reasons why certain things like control of market power of platforms is done better at regional level, but probably in Europe, the main one is that we are working for a single market. If we let national states break the platform regulation in 27 directions, that would mess up, because platforms are now so important, would mess up our single market, would be a real step back. And that's a very important reason why. So I think that that should be thought out, but still, I like this idea to see the public service issues and try to put in a table in which the column are the levels. I like it, but it needs to be thought more. Three specific quickly comments, and then I conclude on one thing different. Okay, this Okay, public financing is discussed as one of the three things on which platform could be challenged by a public service duty, let's say. The first one is financing. I think that these three, the three in the paper are good, but they are not all of them, but Matthias just said it, so I agree. And I think this is a real novel part of the paper, so need to be really worked on. Financing is becoming a major issue again. For instance, on telecom, now there is a huge discussion about the fact we have to do 5G, we have to do all these new things. Who finances it? Why platforms shouldn't pay their fare? That's exactly what the authors are saying, Exactly.
Netflix congestion.
Absolutely, absolutely. But let me say that this debate was done 10 and 15 years ago, or even 20 in the US, exactly with the same terms. You may remember the boss of the AT&T saying, they are using my pipes and they are not paying 20 years ago. What is the difference? There is a difference. The difference is that 20 years ago, the boss of AT&T was wrong because they more or less were paying internet access as everybody pays on a network that was created on monopoly legacy. Now we have to recreate this network in 5G, in very high capacity networks. So the issue is who pays. You cannot expect that to pay the people that don't have any more than, or don't manage to get all the money. So it's a legitimate, serious question because we are creating new, wherever we are creating new networks. This also is valid at the opposite. When you are not creating new networks, it's not as a legitimate question. So it's something I wanted to underline. Second point I wanted to underline here is the authors have this algorithm network effect beyond the direct network effect and indirect network effect. I think this adds confusion. It's not something that is in reality. I think that what platforms do is magnify and exploit totally direct and indirect network effect and their feedbacks among groups. We don't need another category. I think the other category doesn't work. Finally, it's my last criticism in a paper that I like very much. The authors misplace their contribution in a sense. Their contribution, they say at some point, the platform business model has been studied enough in certain direction. That's not true. Gower and all these people are studying ecosystem, the business model and so on. So there is a lot of work. One could say that we didn't manage to kind of mix what the Gower and the management people are doing with the economics a la Tirol. We didn't manage yet to mix these two literature, economics and engineering, but everybody is studying. What instead is behind is exactly what the contribution of the authors, the public service part, that is the innovative part of this paper, okay? So you are unfair to people that are studying, but you are, in this way, you are not really evaluating fully what is your contribution, in my opinion, to this paper. So let me say that I think that this should be really concentrated also on the final part of the paper, the idea of looking at what is public service and the relation in the age of platforms. So you have three examples, financing already discussed. The other two are very important, continuity of service and public objectives. I don't have much to say. That's really difficult and new stuff. So you have open a discussion. Let me say only one thing on continuity of service. When you think about telephone, you remember that at some point, telephone regulation was saying, well, we cannot let people Skype doing certain things because they don't have continuity of service, because the fixed line has the electricity safeness and things like this. So this is really universal service, if you want. But then now we are all using the mobiles. We don't care anymore about this thing. Most of the young people don't have fixed lines at all, if not for internet. and when mobile gets quicker, probably even that reason will disappear. So continuity of service is an important concept, clearly in electricity, clearly in certain general purpose technology is important, but it's a more complex and more nuanced issue. And I think that the real issue with platform, and it's funny to say because platform offer many things at zero price, but I think it's the affordability, one of the points that needs to be really dealt with. And I suggest to look into affordability a bit better in the paper about what is the idea of the public service there, okay? And then there is the final thing that is public objectives, but this we have discussed in this meeting, and is very complex. And however, let me say that I really like this direction of thinking, and I think you could be a very important contribution on this. Thank you. Thank you.